Hi, in this video we'll go over the creation of modular game assets. This will be done using Autodesk Maya. This is a beginner level tutorial for creating game assets, but some prior knowledge of Maya is assumed. Okay, so to unwrap this, to start with, here's one that's already unwrapped, just to quickly show what we're trying to do. It's obviously a very simple unwrap, it's just a cube, but we want to make sure that the bricks all align fairly well. So we've got the sort of grout coming through, matching on the sides, and underneath we've got the length. So to start with, I'll just redo this to demonstrate the process. I'm going to start selecting my object and camera-based unwrapping. I typically always start with a camera-based unwrap. It just gives you no seams, so it's a good starting point. It's not really necessary for such a simple object, but like I said, it starts for us. What I'll do is just select these two faces, which I'm going to match. I'll turn off the texture so we can see what I'm doing. So I've got these two faces selected. Now, these are facing in this direction, which is the blue. Blue is Z. We can always check that. So I know that that's Z because it's blue. So I'm going to UV planar, make sure that's set to Z and project. If I turn on my checkers, we can see that's a perfect unwrap. I'm just going to scale that down a little for now. Actually, I'll undo that. I think I'll attempt to leave that at full size. I'll just see how I go. That should work. Now what I'll do is the two sides that are in this direction, which we know is the x-axis because it's red. So planar projection, x-axis, and we can see obviously I've got those two sides selected. Apply. I'll just turn on the checkers so you can see what's happening here. I'm just going to eyeball this one, just scaling this, watching my viewport, so they end up at fairly close to being square. So that looks about right. And for now, I'll just move them over here. And we'll do the same, the top and the bottom faces. If I turn off my checker, this button, just we can see there, it's the top and bottom, and these are in the y-axis because it's green, vertical. UV planar mapping in the y, project, and I wanted to look at my checkers, take a look and scale these guys in the y this time instead of horizontal, or instead of vertical, we're going horizontal, making sure they look fairly close. And again, I'm happy just to eyeball that for this. Just a touch more. Okay, so now I'll turn off the checker and we'll take a look at the bricks that I've got aligned this checker, this texture. So these vertical ones. If I align them so that they overlap with the fronts there, that will be the best way to guarantee that I get these vertical lines aligning through the corners. But what I believe I'll need to do is, so just using my Move UV Shell tool, with that active I can select one and separate these, because what I should need to do is move one to the bottom and one to the top. The reason this is at the bottom, which is not great, is this edge, these UVs. Sorry, turn off that tool. There we go. That should hit W. These UVs that I have selected, okay, just undo that, that was wrong. I thought they were down there. All right, what am I doing? These faces. So this face is the top, which belongs with this edge here. So this needs to match up here. What we can see is that this edge that I currently have selected, with this being at the bottom, if I move this down in here, it won't match because this edge down there for this top face is the same, connecting to the same. So basically I need to rotate this. So I've just clicked the rotate button 3 times. I'll just undo that. A more productive way is to flip the UVs in the Y direction. And so now what happens is this edge at the top is this edge. And the reason I've done that is that when I move them down, these 2 edges are now corresponding. And if I zoom in, we can see. So when I move those, we can see it's slightly off kilt. It's not perfectly aligned. I need to move them slightly to the side. For now that works though. I'll just do the bottom one and then fix up the fact that this is extending outside of my 0, 1 space. So with the bottom one here, just positioning it so that it looks fairly close. I might actually just scale it outwards a touch, just so that that is aligning a little better. So as you can see, I'm not concerned about having perfectly sized. That's slightly rectangular, but what matters is that the particular texture that I'm using aligns more cleanly, appropriately. So now I've got this problem that these UVs are outside of my 0, 1 space. So with all of the whole lot selected, I'm just going to scale them in a little bit. So I do have a tiny bit of unused UV space. You always want to minimize that to allow as much resolution in your texture as possible. So I'm just eyeballing it for this asset. It's not a problem. So it's inside the 0, 1 space and they match. So now I just need to do the same with these sides. So just selecting a single face, which is this face here. Again, I'm not concerned about overlapping UVs. Just hit Q to get out of that move tool. That's why it's snapping weirdly, hitting my W key. One thing I can do is snap this shell to the main, this front face, this main section. And the way I can do that, by holding down, just like you do in your viewport when you want to change the pivot point. So in here, in my viewport, when I want to change my pivot point, I can hold down D, which lets me go into move pivot mode. So that's moving my pivot. And if I hold down V, V for vertice, you see the snap to vert icon appears, snap to point. So holding down D and V, that lets me snap my pivot point up there. The reason I just demonstrated that is perhaps you're more familiar with that happening in the viewport, and that's what happens just the same in the UV editor. So for these verts, by selecting just those UVs, so I'm in UV mode, I selected the UVs I want, I'm holding down D, which lets me move my pivot for those 4 UVs, and I hold down V for vertice. So that's just moved the pivot point for those. And now I can hold down V and it snaps. I'll select this one, hold down V, oops. What I meant to do was select the whole lot, hold down V over this Just have to reposition that. So hold down D and V. Now I'm holding down V over here and snapping this. So that's just all that's done is perfectly align that shell with this shell. And being able to align your shells by snapping your vertices, moving the pivot points of the UVs, and then snapping those UVs to other UV positions is a very useful technique for getting a correct alignment. In this particular case, it's not working because of the brick texture isn't perfect. So I'm just manually, actually, I'm looking at the wrong one there. It's on this side. I'll just undo that move. Okay, so this one is perfect. So I've snapped it here and we can see each horizontal line on the texture is correctly aligning. I'm just going to manually shift it though, just a little to get this vertical one in the center. And now on this side, I'll do the same thing. So I am selecting the UVs, holding down D to move my pivot point and holding down V to snap it to the vert. Letting go, and now I am holding down V for vert to snap this pivot to this vert over here. And we can see instantly that has perfectly aligned in the horizontal because my shell is the exact same size as this face shell. And again, I'm just going to position it horizontally a little bit just to get these vertical brick sections. And that's about it. So because I'm not doing anything too fancy, I'm not texturing this in any real special way, I can get away with these overlapping shells, but be aware that potentially that could be a problem if I wanted to, say, have broken brick textures, or if I wanted to come back and in Photoshop make maybe some of these bricks a little darker than others and sort of create a bit of differentiation between the sections of the brick wall. If I did, say, this section here in the UVs, that's going to overlap. I'm going to see the exact same, any texture change I make there will appear on the side, in the front, and perhaps the top. So if I was going to do that, I would simply reduce the size of these and make sure that these aren't overlapping. But because I'm not doing anything too complex, I just want to use as much UV space as possible and have a little bit of overlapping. That's not a big problem. So that's the unwrap, and let's move on to creating the bends and create the rest of the shape. Okay, so to start with, I'm duplicating this model. As you can see, I've moved the pivot point to the corner. It lets me easily position. Now for the bend, I'm using bend modifiers, bend deformers, in order to create this. But for the bend to work, of course, we need to have subdivisions. You can't make a flat cube bend. So I'm using the multi-cut tool, holding down Control to just insert some edge loops, and holding down Shift as well to snap those. So going into my bend deformer, I'll just turn on the Y so we can see the deformer here. If I go into the attribute editor, I can slide the curvature attribute, and we can see the direction it's facing. So you need to rotate that. Now, I tend to just work in the channel box is sufficient, and type in a manual, so I'm getting an accurate amount in the rotation, so 90 degrees rather than, say, 87.3 degrees. So we're rotating in the correct direction, and now I'm just moving the center of the bend tool to the bottom, snapping it in the side view, just to make sure that it bends from the base. So as I play with the upper and lower bounds, we can see what's happening, and as I increase the bend to exactly 45 degrees or 90 degrees, we can see we get a nice smooth bend. Now if I move the object with the bend still active, that changes as I move it. So I need to delete history, and now when I move it, you see no problems. It's locked in. So that gives me my first shape, and that's a very simple one. Now what I want to do is make this bend around the corner. sort of concave. So I'm selecting the two panels and combining them, and I'm snapping my pivot to the corner, duplicating, and then just holding down V to snap the duplicated section over to the side. Using my multi-cut tool to quickly put in a couple of edge loops and holding down Shift to make sure it snaps vertically. And because these are two sections, it didn't go through. I would need to clean that up a little bit, just merge the verts. But now that I have vertical edge loops, this will let me bend vertically. But before I do this, I want to duplicate so that I have a backup. So going back to the original bend deformer, we can see that there in the vertical. Back to my channel box. And I usually just increase it right away, but I'll type in 45 here as a starting point. And we'll rotate it so I can work out which direction I want it to go. And you can see I want it to go backwards. So once you do that, it becomes obvious which axis you're rotating. So in this case, the rotate X, setting that to 90 degrees. And what I'm doing is jumping to the top view. And I'll just try and move the position of the bend deformer. I'll just do this in wireframe. I'll just position the bend in that corner, snapping it to the pivot there. So I'm holding down V to snap to vert, or snap to point. I need to change the lower bounds to get that to turn, but I also need to increase the curvature. I've just clicked on the wrong curvature there. It won't let me change that one. I need to come down to the inputs. So I want that to turn 90 degrees. And so once that's done, we can see that's perfectly aligned. And so I'm happy with that. I'll just delete history to lock it in, and I'll duplicate it over to the other side and mirror it. Basically just scale in negative X. So now that I have those two, I'm duplicating them and bringing them out, because I've noticed that lets me make a nice pipe quite easily. So just bringing those together, snapping my pivot to the corner, which will let me duplicate it. Just deleting those inside faces, because when I merge them, we don't want faces on the inside that we won't see. Combine, snapping my pivot to the bottom, just manually positioning it, holding down D to move my pivot, and just duplicating to make a couple of examples to see how it looks. One thing I didn't do there was merge. Now what I want to do is copy this image, this sort of half pipe section. And this one's a little bit more tricky. So firstly, I'm just increasing the number of edge loops that I've got, manually inserting those. I could just use the insert edge loop tool and set it in the options to the exact number that I want, but I'm happy for now just quickly manually adding those. Adding my bend modifier, getting the curvature in there and rotating it so it's the direction I want. Now, changing the bounds isn't getting the effect I'm after. What I really want is a 180 degree pipe with the ends of the pipe extruding out. So I'm deleting the bend. I'm just going to manually model the shape I want. It's just a slight adjustment. And I'll just do it to half and then duplicate the other half back. So less work. So delete half. I'm just going to this side face here and rotating it and positioning 45 degrees. I'll just fix up this edge loop so that the whole flow, the topology there is cleaner. So rotating that so it's 45 degrees. And that's about it. I'm just moving that out a little bit. It's a pretty minor change. Snapping that vert to the middle, duplicating and scaling -1. Combine those objects. I'm just going to merge these verts. Okay, so that gives me the bottom section for this convex pipe. Now for the top section, I'm duplicating with my pivot obviously snapped to the bottom. Adding a bend, and we can see it's not going to work. So I'm experimenting with a couple of settings, but there's a very important problem, and that's that I don't have any edge loops to allow me to bend in that direction. So I need to add those extra edge loops. Now that I've added those, I'll add the bend deformer, come into the inputs, and again set up the direction I want it to bend. So it's 90 degrees in the X this time, negative 90 by the look of it. 45-degree bend, and I'll jump into the side view and just position the bend to snap with the piece underneath. So I'm just moving that vert, the position of the bend, to align with the very top of the bottom piece. And then changing the bounds to make sure that bends correctly. I feel like it's just a little bit distorted. We can see some wavy lines in the texture, and you can see as I insert these edge loops, those wavy lines correct themselves. And that's because with the bend still active, the extra edge loops gives us a smoother bend. And when I'm happy, delete the history, and that concludes that section. But we can see the problem. They don't match up. So I'm just undoing, coming back to where I was setting up the bend. And at this stage, I'm just experimenting. And basically trying to work out why I'm getting a taller section for this side bend. What I've found is that by positioning the bend forwards and backwards, it's changing its scale. And what I need to do is position it so that it's correctly aligned with the front of the wall piece next to it. So where you position your bend, where you position that deformer, will determine the scale of the bend. And that's basically wrapping it up. All I'm doing now is duplicating a few sections. So I'll speed this section up. You can see I'm just experimenting with the shape. It doesn't really matter what I make here, but it's kind of like playing with Lego. I'm just positioning these pieces around until I'm happy. And now I'm ready to bring them into Unity. But before I do that, what I want to do is snap them all to the center grid so that each piece can be brought into Unity correctly aligned to the world origins, which will let me use them as building blocks like Lego pieces inside of Unity. So I've exported the individual components, and we'll just jump to Unity where I've brought them in. We can see they appear exactly if I bring them all into the Unity scene at the same time. They appear on top of each other, but that is what we want. We want them all aligned to the world origins. And so now it's very easy in Unity to run through and treat them as these building blocks and modular assets that can quickly build up into any sort of structure that we want. So that's the foundations of using the bend modifier and the grid and snapping our pivot points to build fairly simple but very flexible modular assets for game environments. Thanks for watching.